They say you never truly know someone until you see what they hide in the dark. I learned this lesson at 74 years old, standing in a cemetery at midnight with a shovel in my hands, about to unearth a secret that would shatter everything I believed about the man I'd called my husband for 30 years. What I found in that grave wasn't a body. It was the truth. And the truth, as it turned out, was far more disturbing than any corpse could ever be. My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 76 years old now. For 3 decades I lived a lie so carefully constructed that even I didn't know I was trapped inside it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how I discovered that my husband's weekly visits to honor his dead wife were actually something else entirely. Something that would force me to question every moment of our marriage, every whispered "I love you," every promise he'd ever made. But before I tell you about the night I took a shovel to hallowed ground, I need to take you back to where it all began. I was 44 years old when I met Thomas Miller. It was 1994, and I had already lived what felt like a complete lifetime. I'd been married once before, to a man named David who died in a construction accident when I was 38. We'd had 6 good years together, no children despite our hopes, and his death left me adrift in a way I hadn't anticipated. David had been my college sweetheart, the boy who held my hand during philosophy lectures and brought me coffee during late-night study sessions. When he died, I thought that chapter of love had closed permanently in my life. I spent the next 6 years rebuilding myself. I threw myself into my work as a librarian at the Riverside Public Library, a beautiful old building with high ceilings and the kind of musty book smell that made me feel safe. I lived in a small apartment above a bakery on Maple Street, where the smell of fresh bread would wake me each morning. My life was quiet, predictable, and somehow that felt appropriate for a widow approaching middle age. I had my routines, my small circle of friends, my Saturday morning walks through Riverside Park, my Tuesday book club meetings. It wasn't a bad life. It just wasn't a particularly vibrant one. Thomas came into the library on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I remember because it was the first truly warm day after a brutal winter, and the library's old heating system was struggling to adjust, making the main reading room alternately too hot and too cold. I was shelving returns in the biography section when I noticed him standing near the reference desk, looking somewhat lost. He was tall, probably 6'2", with salt and pepper hair that was more salt than pepper, and he wore wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a professorial air. He had on a brown cardigan over a button-down shirt, khaki pants, and worn leather shoes that suggested comfort over fashion. I approached him with my professional librarian smile. "Can I help you find something?" He turned to me and I noticed his eyes first. They were a warm hazel, the kind that seemed to change color depending on the light. But there was something in them, a deep sadness that seemed permanent, like a stain that had set long ago. "I'm looking for books on grief," he said quietly. His voice was soft, measured, the voice of someone who chose his words carefully. Specifically, books about coping with the loss of a spouse. I felt an immediate kinship with this stranger. "I'm very sorry for your loss," I said, and I meant it. "My own husband passed away 6 years ago. I know how difficult it can be." Something shifted in his expression then, a recognition of shared pain. He nodded slowly. "My wife Elizabeth died 2 years ago. Cancer." I thought I was managing well enough, but lately I find myself struggling more, not less. I led him to our self-help section, pulling several titles I'd read myself in those dark months after David's death. We talked for nearly an hour, standing between the shelves, our conversation flowing from books to loss to the strange landscape of grief that only those who've walked it truly understand. He told me he'd been married to Elizabeth for 18 years, that she died at 41, far too young. He told me about the hospital vigils, the false hopes, the final terrible weeks. I shared my own story, the sudden shock of David's accident, the way grief had ambushed me at unexpected moments. Before he left that day, he checked out 3 books and asked if I'd like to have coffee sometime. Not a date, he clarified quickly, his cheeks coloring slightly. "Just, it's nice to talk to someone who understands." I said yes. Our friendship developed slowly, carefully, like 2 people who'd been burned learning to trust heat again. We met for coffee every Thursday afternoon at the Riverside Cafe, a cozy spot 3 blocks from the library with mismatched furniture and excellent pie. We talked about our lost spouses, about our lives before and after loss, about books and music and the small observations that make up a life. Thomas was a high school English teacher at Riverside Academy, and he spoke about his students with genuine affection. He'd been teaching for 20 years, and you could tell it was more than just a job to him. What struck me most about Thomas in those early months was his devotion to Elizabeth's memory. Every Sunday, without fail, he visited her grave at Riverside Memorial Cemetery. He told me this matter-of-factly, not as if it were unusual or excessive, but as a simple fact of his weekly routine. Every Sunday at 10 in the morning, he would drive to the cemetery with fresh flowers, spend an hour there, and then go about his day. I found it touching, this steadfast loyalty to his lost love. It spoke to a depth of feeling that I admired. David had been buried in his hometown 3 hours away, and I'd only managed to visit his grave a handful of times in 6 years. The distance made regular visits impractical, but truthfully, I also found cemeteries deeply unsettling. The marble headstones, the too green grass, the artificial flowers that never died, it all felt wrong to me, like we were trying to make death palatable by prettying it up. But Thomas seemed to find comfort in his Sunday ritual. He would tell me about it sometimes, how he talked to Elizabeth, update her on his life, tell her about his students or a book he'd read. "I think she'd have liked you," he said once, about 4 months into our friendship. "She always said I needed someone who understood books the way I do." The comment made me blush, though I tried to hide it. We were just friends, two lonely people finding solace in shared experience. At least that's what I told myself. It was Thomas who first suggested we might be more than friends. We'd been meeting for coffee for nearly 8 months when he asked me to dinner at Antonio's, a nice Italian restaurant downtown. This time he said it was a date, a real one. I was terrified. At 45, I felt too old to be dating, too set in my ways, too aware of all the ways love could end badly. But there was something about Thomas's gentle persistence, his obvious care, that made me willing to try. That first dinner date led to another and another. We went to movies, to concerts at the community center, to art exhibits at the local gallery. He brought me books he thought I'd enjoy. I made him dinner at my apartment, nervously preparing David's favorite recipe before realizing what I'd done and starting over with something new. We were both trying to build something fresh while honoring what we'd lost. A delicate balance that required constant adjustment. 6 months after that first dinner date, Thomas proposed. We were sitting in Riverside Park on a Saturday morning in October, watching the leaves turn brilliant shades of orange and red. The air was crisp, and we just bought hot apple cider from a vendor near the fountain. "Margaret," he said, his voice slightly shaky, "I know we both thought we'd had our chance at marriage, at building a life with someone. But being with you these past months has shown me that maybe we get more than one chance. Maybe life gives us second acts if we're brave enough to take them." He pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond, elegant and understated. "Will you marry me? Will you build a second act with me?" I said yes through tears, happy tears this time, not the grief-stricken ones I'd cried so often in the years since David's death. We married 3 months later in a small ceremony at the Riverside Community Church. It was January of 1996, a cold day with snow falling softly outside the church windows. My sister Claire was my maid of honor. Thomas's brother Robert was his best man. There were perhaps 30 people there, close friends and family, the kind of intimate gathering that felt right for two middle-aged people finding love again. I moved into Thomas's house on Birch Lane, a charming 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a maple tree in the front yard that turned spectacular shades of red each autumn. The house was filled with traces of Elizabeth, photos on the mantel, her books still on the shelves, her garden tools still in the shed. Thomas asked if I wanted him to pack these things away, but I said no. I understood that Elizabeth had been a real person, a real love, and trying to erase her would be disrespectful to both her memory and to the man Thomas had been when he loved her. What I didn't realize then was that I was moving into a house haunted not by Elizabeth's memory, but by something far more complicated. Our marriage started well. Thomas was attentive, thoughtful, the kind of husband who left notes on the bathroom mirror and brought home my favorite tea without being asked. We settled into comfortable routines. I would wake early and make breakfast while he showered. We'd eat together, reading different sections of the newspaper, occasionally sharing interesting articles. I'd head to the library by 8, and he'd leave for the high school by 7:30. Evenings were spent cooking together, watching television, reading in the living room with our legs tangled together on the couch. And every Sunday, Thomas visited Elizabeth's grave. First, I thought nothing of it. It seemed natural that he would want to maintain this connection, this ritual that had sustained him through the worst of his grief. I even offered to go with him once, about 2 months into our marriage, but he gently declined. "I appreciate the offer," he said, touching my cheek softly, "but this is something I need to do alone. It's my time to talk to her, to keep that connection. You understand, don't you?" I did understand. Or at least I thought I did. The routine continued unchanging. Every Sunday morning at 9:45, Thomas would put on his jacket, pick up the fresh flowers he'd bought the day before, and drive to Riverside Memorial Cemetery. He'd be gone for exactly 2 hours, returning home at noon. We'd have lunch together, and the rest of the day would proceed normally. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It wasn't until we'd been married for about 8 months that I started to notice small inconsistencies. The first was the flowers. Thomas always bought flowers on Saturday afternoon from Morton's flower shop on Main Street. For the first 6 months of our marriage, he always bought white lilies, which he said were Elizabeth's favorite. But one Saturday in September, I noticed he bought red roses instead. I thought Elizabeth preferred lilies, I mentioned casually as he arranged them in water to keep them fresh overnight. He paused for just a fraction of a second before responding. "She did, but I thought I'd try something different. The roses were beautiful today." It was such a small thing, barely worth noticing. But something about his pause, the slight hesitation, stuck with me. The second inconsistency came a few weeks later. Thomas had always said he spent an hour at the cemetery, talking to Elizabeth, tending her grave, sitting quietly in reflection. But one Sunday in early October, I happened to glance at the clock when he left and again when he returned. He'd been gone for 2 hours and 15 minutes, not the usual 2 hours exactly. "How was your visit?" I asked when he came home. "Good, peaceful as always," he replied, hanging up his jacket. "You were gone a bit longer today." Another pause, briefer this time but still there. Was I? I guess I lost track of time. It was such a beautiful morning. I just sat there longer than usual. Again, perfectly reasonable. But the pattern of small pauses, tiny hesitations, began to accumulate in my mind like drops of water that would eventually overflow. The third inconsistency was more troubling. It was mid-November, and Thomas had come home from his Sunday visit with mud on his pants, quite a lot of it, caked on the knees and scattered up the legs. When I pointed it out, he looked down as if surprised. "Oh, I must have knelt on a wet patch," he said. "It rained yesterday, so the ground was probably still muddy. But it had been 3 days since the rain, and November's cold would have frozen most of the ground solid." I said nothing, but I noticed. I filed it away with the other small oddities that were beginning to form a pattern I didn't yet want to acknowledge. That first year of marriage passed, and then the second. Life continued its comfortable rhythm. I got promoted to head librarian, a position that came with more responsibility, but also more satisfaction. Thomas received an award for his teaching, given by former students who'd gone on to successful careers, and credited him with inspiring their love of literature. We took a trip to Maine that summer, staying in a bed and breakfast overlooking the ocean, collecting shells on the beach, eating lobster rolls, and feeling grateful for this second chance at love. But the Sunday cemetery visits continued, unchanged and unchanging, a fixed point around which the rest of our life revolved. And the small inconsistencies continued too, never enough to really worry about, but enough to create a low hum of unease that I couldn't quite silence. There was the time I found fresh dirt under his fingernails when he came home, as if he'd been digging. There was the Sunday he came back with a small tear in his shirt that he claimed happened when he caught it on a branch near the grave, though Riverside Memorial was meticulously maintained with no overhanging branches near any of the plots. There was the occasion when I smelled perfume on his clothes, a floral scent that definitely wasn't mine, and when I mentioned it, he said it must have been from the flowers, though I'd never noticed flowers leaving such a strong scent on fabric before. Each incident had a plausible explanation. Each time I told myself I was being paranoid, overly suspicious, perhaps projecting my own insecurities onto an innocent situation. Thomas was a devoted widower honoring his first wife's memory. That was all. That was everything. But 3 years into our marriage, something happened that I couldn't explain away. It was a Sunday in April, the kind of spring day that makes you remember why you endure winter. The dogwoods were blooming, painting the neighborhood in clouds of white and pink. Thomas had left for the cemetery at his usual time, and I decided to do some spring cleaning. I was going through the coat closet near the front door, sorting through jackets we no longer wore, planning to donate some to the church charity drive. That's when I found the receipt. It had fallen out of the pocket of Thomas's brown corduroy jacket, the one he often wore on cooler days. The receipt was from Morton's flower shop, dated from the previous Saturday, and it showed a purchase of 2 dozen red roses. But Thomas had only brought home 1 dozen roses the day before. I knew because I'd watched him put them in water, counting them unconsciously as he'd arranged them in the vase. 12 roses, not 24. I stood in the hallway holding that receipt, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it was an error. Maybe the shop had charged him for 2 dozen but only given him 1. Maybe he'd bought flowers for someone else, though who? We had no upcoming events, no birthdays, no anniversaries except our own, which was months away. Or maybe my mind whispered he was bringing flowers to someone who wasn't dead. The thought, once formed, was impossible to dislodge. I tried to push it away, tried to focus on the innocent explanations, but it clung to me like spider silk, invisible but impossible to completely brush off. When Thomas came home that day, I almost confronted him with the receipt. Almost. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear of looking foolish if there was a simple explanation. Maybe it was fear of what I'd discover if there wasn't. Instead, I put the receipt in my jewelry box, hidden beneath my pearl necklace, and said nothing. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay next to Thomas, listening to his steady breathing, and wondered if I was lying next to a stranger. The man I'd married was kind, devoted, honest, wasn't he? But then I'd thought the same thing 3 years ago when I'd agreed to marry him, and now I had a receipt that suggested he was buying twice as many flowers as he brought home. In the weeks that followed, I became hyper-aware of Thomas's behavior on Sundays. I started noting the exact time he left and returned. I observed what he wore, looking for any signs of inconsistency when he came back. I even started checking the odometer on his car, calculating the mileage to Riverside Memorial Cemetery and back. It was 6.3 miles each way, 12.6 miles round trip. But several times the odometer showed he'd driven 15 or 16 miles. Where was he going on those extra miles? I felt guilty about this surveillance, this creeping suspicion that was transforming me into someone I didn't recognize. But I also felt justified. Something was wrong. I knew it the way you know it's going to rain, not because you can see the clouds, but because you can feel the change in air pressure, the electricity building before the storm. It was my sister Claire who finally forced me to voice my suspicions. We were having lunch at the Riverside Cafe in late May, our monthly tradition, when she commented on how distracted I seemed. "What's going on, Maggie?" she asked, using the childhood nickname only she was allowed to use. "You've been somewhere else entirely this whole lunch." Claire was 4 years younger than me, but she'd always been the more direct one, the one who said what needed to be said regardless of how uncomfortable it might be. She'd never particularly warmed to Thomas, though she'd never said why. "Just something about him I can't quite put my finger on," she'd told me before the wedding. "But if you love him, I'm happy for you." Now, sitting across from her with her sharp blue eyes studying my face, I felt the dam break. "I think Thomas might be seeing someone else," I said quietly, the words feeling simultaneously ridiculous and terrifying. Claire's expression didn't change to shock or disbelief. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if I'd just confirmed something she'd already suspected. "What makes you think that?" I told her everything. The inconsistencies, the receipt, the extra mileage, the mud and the torn shirt and the perfume. As I listed them, they sounded flimsy, circumstantial, the paranoid imaginings of an insecure wife. But Claire listened without interrupting, her face growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee though she took it black and there was nothing to stir. "How often does he go to this cemetery?" she finally asked. "Every Sunday. Without fail. In 3 years he's never missed a single week." "And you've never gone with him?" "Not even once. He said he preferred to go alone. That it was his private time with Elizabeth's memory." Claire's mouth tightened into a thin line. Maggie, I love you and I don't want to upset you, but you need to consider the possibility that he's not going to a cemetery at all. Or if he is, he's not spending 2 hours sitting at a grave. The thought had occurred to me, of course, in those sleepless nights. But hearing Claire say it out loud made it real in a way my own suspicions hadn't. What should I do? I asked, hearing the plea in my own voice. Follow him, Claire said simply. This Sunday, follow him and see where he really goes. The suggestion felt wrong, invasive, the kind of thing that betrayed the fundamental trust a marriage should be built on. But then again, if Thomas was lying to me, hadn't he already betrayed that trust? I spent the rest of the week in a state of anxious anticipation. Part of me hoped something would happen to make this surveillance unnecessary. Maybe Thomas would suddenly volunteer to take me with him to the cemetery. Maybe he'd explain the inconsistencies on his own. Maybe I'd find some innocent explanation for everything that would allow me to laugh at my own paranoia. But nothing changed. Saturday arrived and Thomas bought his usual flowers, red roses this time, though he'd sometimes switch to tulips or daisies. He seemed completely normal, discussing plans for dinner, mentioning a difficult student he was trying to help, asking about a new book display I was planning at the library. That night I barely slept. I'd borrowed Claire's car earlier in the week, parking it 3 blocks away where Thomas wouldn't see it. My plan was simple. Wait for Thomas to leave, then follow him at a distance. I'd never done anything like this before, and my hands were sweating just thinking about it. Sunday morning arrived with clouds that promised rain. Thomas woke at his usual time, showered, dressed in khaki pants and a blue button-down shirt. He had breakfast, 2 eggs over easy and whole wheat toast, the same breakfast he had every Sunday. At 9:45 exactly, he picked up his flowers and headed for the door. I'm off, he said, kissing my cheek. I'll be back at noon. Maybe we can take a walk this afternoon if the rain holds off. That sounds lovely, I replied, my voice sounding strange in my own ears, too high, too bright. He left, and I counted to 30 before grabbing my purse and rushing out the back door. I ran the 3 blocks to where I'd parked Claire's silver Honda, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. By the time I reached the car and fumbled with the keys, 2 precious minutes had passed. What if I'd lost him already? What if he'd taken a different route? But no, as I turned onto Birch Lane, I spotted his dark blue sedan 3 blocks ahead, stopped at a red light. I held back, keeping 2 cars between us, trying to remember everything I'd ever seen in movies about following someone without being noticed. Thomas turned right onto Maple Street, heading in the direction of Riverside Memorial Cemetery, just as he should be. I felt a wave of relief mixed with disappointment. Maybe I really was paranoid. Maybe he really was just visiting Elizabeth's grave. And all my suspicions were the product of an overactive imagination and too many mystery novels. But then, just before the turn that would take him to the cemetery, Thomas's car continued straight. He drove past the cemetery entrance without slowing down, without even glancing in that direction. My stomach dropped. Claire had been right. He wasn't going to the cemetery at all. I followed at a careful distance as Thomas drove through town and out onto Highway 17, heading south. We passed the shopping plaza, the new housing development, the old dairy farm that had been converted into a petting zoo. With each mile we moved further from anything familiar, further from any place Thomas had ever mentioned visiting. After about 20 minutes, he turned off the highway onto a smaller road I'd never noticed before, barely more than a paved lane cutting through dense woods. I held back further, worried he'd notice he was being followed on such a quiet road. The trees pressed in on both sides, their spring leaves creating a green tunnel that blocked out most of the morning light. Then suddenly, the trees opened up into a clearing, and I saw where Thomas had been going every Sunday for the past 3 years. It was a house, or more accurately, a cottage, small and well-maintained with pale yellow siding and white trim. There was a garden in front, carefully tended, full of roses and tulips and daisies, all the flowers Thomas brought here each week. A white picket fence surrounded the property, the kind you see in storybooks, and there was a mailbox at the end of the driveway with a name painted on it in careful script. The name was Elizabeth Miller. I pulled over onto the shoulder about 100 yards away, partially hidden by trees, and watched. Thomas parked in the driveway, got out with his flowers and walked to the front door. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door with a key and went inside. My mind was reeling. Elizabeth Miller. His dead wife. But that was impossible. Elizabeth had died 4 years ago of cancer. Thomas had grieved, had needed books on coping with loss, had visited her grave every Sunday for 2 years before we'd even met. Except he wasn't visiting her grave. He was visiting a house with her name on the mailbox. A house he had a key to. A house he'd been coming to every single Sunday of our marriage while telling me he was sitting beside a headstone talking to a woman who was supposed to be dead. I sat in that car for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, my thoughts spinning, unable to settle on any single explanation. Was Elizabeth alive? Had she faked her death? But why? For what purpose? And if she was alive, what did that mean about my marriage to Thomas? Was he even legally my husband if his first wife was still living? Or maybe, my mind suggested hopefully, Elizabeth was a daughter he'd never mentioned. Or a sister. Maybe there was some innocent explanation for why a house bore the name of his supposedly deceased wife. But even as I tried to construct innocent scenarios, I knew. Deep in my gut, I knew that whatever was happening in that yellow cottage, it wasn't innocent. It was a secret so significant that Thomas had built 3 years of lies around it. I was reaching for my phone, thinking I should call Claire, when the cottage door opened. Thomas emerged, but he wasn't alone. A woman followed him out onto the porch, and even from 100 yards away, I could see she was attractive, probably in her 50s, with shoulder-length auburn hair and a flowing blue dress. They stood close together on that porch, too close for casual acquaintances. Thomas said something that made her laugh. A gesture so intimate it made my chest ache. Then he leaned in and kissed her. Not a friendly peck but a real kiss, the kind that spoke of familiarity and affection, and things I didn't want to name. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. All the air left my lungs at once, and I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. This was worse than I'd imagined. Thomas wasn't just visiting a grave. He was visiting another woman, kissing her, spending 2 hours with her every single Sunday while I waited at home like a fool. But who was she? Was this Elizabeth, somehow alive despite Thomas's elaborate stories of hospital vigils and terminal cancer? Or was this someone else entirely? Someone Thomas had installed in a house bearing his dead wife's name for reasons I couldn't begin to understand? I watched as they spoke for a few more minutes on the porch, then Thomas got back in his car. I ducked down in my seat, praying he wouldn't notice Claire's Honda as he drove past. His car appeared in my rearview mirror, and I held my breath, but he drove by without slowing, heading back the way he'd come. I waited until his car disappeared around a bend before sitting up. I looked at the cottage, at the woman who was now gathering the flowers Thomas had brought and taking them inside. Every instinct told me to drive up to that door, to knock, to demand answers. But another part of me, the part that had been a librarian for 20 years and understood the value of information, told me to wait. To learn more before confronting anyone. I needed to know who this woman was. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I made any moves. I started Claire's car and drove back to town, taking a different route than Thomas so I wouldn't accidentally catch up to him. My mind was churning, trying to process what I'd seen, trying to decide what to do next. By the time I pulled into the parking lot 3 blocks from my house, I'd made a decision. I was going to find out everything. Who this woman was, what her connection to Thomas really was, how long this had been going on. And then, armed with the truth, I would decide what to do about my marriage. I walked back to the house on Birch Lane, let myself in through the back door, and went upstairs to splash cold water on my face. In the bathroom mirror, I looked at my reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were red, her face pale, her expression a mixture of shock and determination. Thomas arrived home at noon exactly, just as he always did. "How was your visit?" I asked, my voice remarkably steady considering the storm raging inside me. "Peaceful," he replied, hanging up his jacket. "I told Elizabeth about the new book you're featuring at the library. I think she would have loved it." The ease with which he lied astonished me. There was no hesitation. No guilt visible in his face. He simply looked at me with those warm hazel eyes and delivered his fiction as if it were absolute truth. "That's nice," I managed to say. "I'm glad you had a good time. We had lunch together, turkey sandwiches and potato salad, making small talk about the weather and our plans for the week. Thomas mentioned he had parent-teacher conferences coming up on Thursday. I told him about a new shipment of books arriving at the library. We were a married couple having a normal Sunday lunch, except everything was a lie. When Thomas went upstairs to change clothes for our afternoon walk, I stood at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard, at the life we'd built together, and wondered how much of it was real. The garden beds we'd planted together, the bird feeder Thomas had hung from the oak tree, the patio furniture we'd chosen after hours of debate about style and durability. Were any of those moments genuine, or had he been thinking about her the whole time, counting the hours until his next Sunday visit? That night, after Thomas fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow I would begin my investigation. Tomorrow, I would start gathering the information I needed to understand what my husband had been hiding for 3 years. But tonight I allowed myself to grieve for the marriage I thought I had, for the man I thought I'd known, for the future I'd believed we were building together. By morning, the grief would have to give way to determination. By morning I would need to become someone different, someone stronger, someone capable of uncovering secrets and facing truths, no matter how painful they might be. The woman in that yellow cottage, whoever she was, had answers. And I was going to get them, even if it meant my entire world came crashing down in the process. Monday morning came with rain, the kind of steady downpour that turns the world gray and makes everything feel heavy. I went through my usual routine on autopilot, making breakfast that I couldn't taste, kissing Thomas goodbye as he left for school, driving to the library through streets that blurred behind my windshield. Whether the blur was from rain or tears, I couldn't quite tell. At work, I sat at my desk pretending to process new acquisitions while my mind replayed the scene from yesterday over and over. The yellow cottage, the woman in the blue dress, the kiss on the porch, the name on the mailbox, Elizabeth Miller. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle I couldn't yet see the shape of, and the not knowing was eating me alive from the inside out. I picked up the phone 3 times to call Claire, but each time I set it back down. What would I even say? That I'd followed my husband and discovered he was visiting another woman? It sounded so tawdry when reduced to those simple facts, like something from a daytime television drama. But this was my life, not fiction, and the betrayal felt like a physical wound. By lunchtime I'd made a decision. I needed information, real information, not just speculation and fear. I needed to know who that woman was, and more importantly, I needed to know if Thomas's first wife Elizabeth had actually died or if her death certificate had been one more elaborate lie in a marriage apparently built on deception. I left the library early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely false. My head was pounding, whether from stress or lack of sleep I wasn't sure. I drove to the Riverside County Courthouse, an imposing brick building downtown that housed all the public records for our area. If Elizabeth Miller had died 4 years ago as Thomas claimed, there would be a death certificate on file. And if there wasn't, well, that would tell me something equally important. The records office was in the basement, a windowless room with fluorescent lighting that flickered occasionally and gave everything a sickly pallor. A young woman with bright pink hair sat at the desk, barely looking up from her computer screen when I approached. "I need to look up a death certificate," I said, my voice sounding strange and formal to my own ears. She slid a form across the counter without looking at me. Name of the deceased, approximate date of death, and relationship to the deceased. I filled out the form with shaking hands. Elizabeth N. Miller. Date of death approximately April 1992. Relationship. I hesitated, then wrote simply inquiry. The young woman took the form, typed something into her computer and frowned. Then she got up and disappeared into the back room where the older records were kept in filing cabinets that predated digital systems. I waited, counting the water stains on the ceiling tiles, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. She returned 15 minutes later carrying a manila folder. "Found it," she said, opening the folder on the counter between us. Elizabeth N. Miller. Died April 18, 1992, at Riverside General Hospital. Cause of death listed as metastatic breast cancer. Here's a copy of the death certificate if you need it. I stared at the document she'd placed in front of me. There it was in black and white, official stamps and signatures, the neat bureaucratic record of a life ended. Elizabeth N. Miller, born March 3, 1951, died April 18, 1992, at the age of 41. Survived by spouse Thomas James Miller. So she really was dead. Thomas hadn't lied about that, at least. But then who was the woman in the yellow cottage? And why did the mailbox bear a dead woman's name? I paid for a copy of the death certificate, though I wasn't sure why I needed it. Evidence perhaps, though, of what I couldn't say. I walked back to my car in a daze, the rain soaking through my jacket, and sat behind the wheel staring at the official document that confirmed Elizabeth Miller had been dead for 4 years. That night at dinner I watched Thomas carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or deception. He ate his pot roast and talked about a student who'd finally understood Gatsby after weeks of struggling with the symbolism. He asked about my day at the library, and I told him the sanitized version, leaving out the part where I'd spent my afternoon verifying his first wife's death. "How's the headache?" he asked with what seemed like genuine concern. "You left work early, didn't you?" For a moment I wondered if he knew somehow that I'd followed him yesterday, if this was some kind of test. But his face showed nothing but mild worry, the expression of a caring husband concerned about his wife's health. Better now, I lied. I think I just needed some rest. That night I couldn't sleep again. I lay next to Thomas, listening to the rain against the windows, and tried to make sense of what I knew. Elizabeth was dead, that was confirmed. But Thomas was visiting someone every Sunday, bringing her flowers, kissing her, spending hours at a cottage that bore his dead wife's name. The facts didn't add up to any logical conclusion. Unless, my mind whispered in the dark, the woman was pretending to be Elizabeth. But why would anyone do that? And why would Thomas participate in such a bizarre charade? By Tuesday I knew what I had to do. I needed to go back to that cottage, but this time I needed to do more than just watch from a distance. I needed answers, and the only way to get them was to confront whoever lived there directly. I called in sick to work on Wednesday, something I almost never did. Thomas left for school at his usual time, and I waited an hour before getting in my car and driving out to Highway 17, retracing the route I'd followed on Sunday. In daylight, without the imperative of keeping up with Thomas's car, I could take my time, noting landmarks, making sure I could find the cottage again. The turnoff came after the petting zoo. A narrow road with a wooden sign so weathered I could barely make out the words Meadowbrook Lane. I drove slowly down the tree-lined road, my stomach churning with nervousness and something close to fear. What would I say when I knocked on that door? How do you ask a stranger why she's pretending to be a dead woman and having an affair with your husband? The cottage looked different in the gray morning light. The garden was still beautiful, bursting with late spring flowers, but there was something melancholy about it now, as if the brightness of the blooms was trying too hard to cover up something darker underneath. I parked on the road rather than pulling into the driveway, giving myself an escape route if I needed it. As I walked up the stone path to the front door, I noticed details I'd missed on Sunday. There was a wooden swing on the porch, the kind meant for 2 people. The windows had lace curtains, old-fashioned and delicate. A cat, orange and white, sat on the porch railing watching me with suspicious green eyes. I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated. Once I knocked, once I opened this door literally and metaphorically, there would be no going back. My marriage, whatever it was, would be irreversibly changed. Part of me wanted to turn around, drive home, pretend I'd never followed Thomas, never seen this place, never started down this path of discovery. But I'd never been good at living with unanswered questions. It was why I'd become a librarian in the first place, drawn to the idea of information, of knowledge, of truth accessible to anyone willing to look for it. I knocked. For a long moment nothing happened. I was about to knock again when I heard footsteps inside, soft and measured. The door opened, and the woman from Sunday stood before me. Up close she was older than I'd thought, probably in her late 50s or early 60s. Her auburn hair had gray threads running through it, and there were lines around her eyes and mouth that spoke of years lived. She wore jeans and a cream-colored sweater, and there was something about her face, something familiar that I couldn't quite place. "Yes," she said, her voice neither friendly nor hostile, simply questioning. "My name is Margaret Miller," I began, watching her face carefully for any reaction to the name. "I'm Thomas Miller's wife." Her expression didn't change, which somehow made it worse. She didn't look surprised or guilty or afraid. She simply looked at me with calm brown eyes and nodded slightly, as if she'd been expecting this visit eventually. "I wondered when you'd come," she said. "You'd better come inside." She stepped back, and after a moment's hesitation I entered. The cottage interior was cozy and lived in, with comfortable furniture that looked well used, bookshelves lining one wall, And photographs everywhere. Photographs of a younger Thomas smiling and carefree in ways I'd never seen. Photographs of this woman, decades younger, with darker hair and fewer lines. Photographs of them together, holding hands, embracing, looking at each other with unmistakable love. And in the center of the mantel, a wedding photograph. Thomas in a dark suit, the woman in a white dress, both of them young and radiant with hope. "Please sit down," the woman said, gesturing to a floral sofa. "Would you like some tea? I find these kinds of conversations go better with tea. Who are you?" The question came out more forcefully than I'd intended, my confusion and anger finally breaking through the careful control I'd been maintaining. She sat in an armchair across from me, folding her hands in her lap with an almost eerie calmness. "My name is Elizabeth Miller. I'm Thomas's wife." "But you're dead," I said stupidly, pulling the death certificate from my purse and holding it up as if it were proof against the living woman sitting across from me. "You died in 1992 of cancer. I have the official record." Elizabeth, if that's really who she was, looked at the document without reaching for it. "Yes, that's what the records say. That's what everyone believes. That's what Thomas has told people for years. But as you can see, I'm very much alive." The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the arm of the sofa, trying to anchor myself to something solid as my understanding of reality crumbled. Why would you fake your death? Why would Thomas tell everyone you died?" Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, looking out at her garden. "It's a long story, and not a particularly pleasant one. Are you sure you want to hear it?" "I need to understand," I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "I've been married to Thomas for 3 years. He comes here every Sunday, and I thought he was visiting your grave. I need to know what's really happening." She turned back to me, and for the first time I saw emotion flicker across her face. Sadness, regret, something that might have been sympathy. "Thomas doesn't know you followed him, does he?" "No. Maybe it should stay that way. Maybe you should go home and forget you ever found this place." I stood up, anger replacing confusion. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to decide how much truth I can handle. I came here for answers, and I'm not leaving without them." Elizabeth studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Sit down then. This will take a while." I sat, and she returned to her chair, arranging herself as if preparing to tell a story she'd rehearsed many times in her head but never actually spoken aloud. "Thomas and I met in college," she began. "We were both English majors, both in love with words and stories and the idea that literature could explain the world. We married young, too young probably, right after graduation. I was 22, he was 23. We thought love was enough." Her voice was steady, almost detached, as if she were talking about characters in a book rather than her own life. "The first few years were good. Thomas got his teaching job at Riverside Academy. I worked as a freelance editor. We bought this cottage, fixed it up together. We talked about having children, maybe 2 or 3. It was an ordinary life, but it was ours and we were happy." She paused, and something shifted in her expression, the careful control slipping just slightly. "Then I got sick. Not cancer, that was a lie. I was diagnosed with severe agoraphobia and panic disorder. It started slowly, getting anxious in crowds, having trouble leaving the house for errands. But it got worse rapidly. Within a year, I couldn't leave this cottage at all. The thought of going beyond that front door would send me into panic attacks so severe I couldn't breathe. I felt a flicker of something, not quite sympathy but understanding. Mental illness carried its own kind of stigma, especially in small towns, especially 20 or 30 years ago. Thomas tried to help," Elizabeth continued. "He really did. He took me to doctors, therapists, tried every treatment available. But nothing worked. And gradually I could see it destroying him. He had to do all the shopping, all the errands, maintain our entire life outside these walls while I hid inside. He loved his teaching, but he started missing parent conferences, school events because he couldn't leave me alone for too long. And socially it was devastating. People in Riverside started asking questions. 'Where's your wife, Thomas? Why doesn't Elizabeth come to church anymore? Why haven't we seen her at school functions?' Small towns don't understand mental illness. They think it's a choice, a weakness, something you should just get over." I remained silent, sensing there was more, that this was leading somewhere darker. "One night about 18 years ago, Thomas came home and made a proposal. He said we should tell people I died. That way, he could have a normal life, attend social functions without awkward questions, maybe even date again eventually. He'd still come here every week, still take care of me, still be my husband in private. But in public, he'd be a widower, free from the burden of explaining why his wife never appeared. The cold calculation of it took my breath away. And you agreed to this? Elizabeth met my eyes and I saw shame there, deep and old. I was terrified of being alone. Thomas was my only connection to the outside world. If I said no, I was afraid he'd leave me anyway, and then I'd have nothing. So yes, I agreed. We faked my death. Thomas got a doctor friend to sign a false death certificate. We held a funeral with a closed casket, supposedly because the cancer had ravaged my appearance. He buried an empty box at Riverside Memorial. And for 18 years I've lived here, alone except for Sundays when Thomas comes to visit. I have groceries delivered. I order everything online. Thomas pays the bills, maintains the house. To the rest of the world I'm dead. But here in this cottage I exist in a kind of limbo, neither fully alive nor fully dead. The weight of her loneliness pressed against me, suffocating in its intensity. But my sympathy was complicated by anger, by the realization of what this meant for me. So when Thomas married me, I said slowly, he was already married to you. Yes, which means my marriage is a lie. I'm not actually his wife at all. Elizabeth looked down at her hands. Legally, no. You're not. Thomas is guilty of bigamy, though I suppose you could argue I'm guilty of fraud for faking my death. We're both criminals in our own ways. I felt numb, as if my body had decided the only way to handle this information was to shut down all feeling entirely. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of building a life together, and all of it was based on a lie so fundamental that nothing else could be trusted. Does he love you? I asked, not sure which answer I wanted to hear. When he comes here on Sundays, is it out of obligation or love? Elizabeth was quiet for a long time before answering. I think he loves the memory of who we were. I think he feels responsible for me, guilty for trapping me in this half-life. But love? Real love? I don't think either of us has felt that in a very long time. We're like ghosts, Thomas and I, haunting each other. And me? Where do I fit into this? She looked at me with something that might have been pity. I think you were his attempt to have a real life again. Thomas is a good man in many ways. He takes care of me, never fails to visit, makes sure I have everything I need. But he's also lonely. He wanted companionship, someone to share his public life with, someone who could give him the normalcy he sacrificed when he chained himself to me. I stood up abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something other than sit in this cottage listening to my life disintegrate. I paced to the window, staring out at the garden without really seeing it. What am I supposed to do with this? I asked, my voice breaking. Do I go home and pretend I don't know? Do I confront Thomas? Do I leave him? Every option seems impossible. That's not for me to decide, Elizabeth said quietly. I gave up my right to influence Thomas's life when I agreed to disappear from it. But you didn't disappear. I turned to face her, my anger finding a target at last. You're right here every single Sunday pulling him back into this lie. You're just as responsible for this mess as he is. You're right, Elizabeth said simply, not defending herself. I am. I was a coward 18 years ago, and I've been a coward every day since. I should have been braver. I should have fought harder against my fears. I should have set Thomas free instead of accepting this half-life. But I didn't, and now we're all trapped in a web of lies that's become too complicated to unravel. I sank back onto the sofa, suddenly exhausted. The anger had burned through me quickly, leaving nothing but ashes and emptiness. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the ticking of a clock somewhere in the cottage, marking time that felt meaningless now that I knew how easily life could be built on falsehoods. What happens now? Elizabeth finally asked. Are you going to expose us? Report Thomas for bigamy? I'd understand if you did. We've wronged you terribly. I don't know, I said honestly. I need time to think. I need to figure out what I want, what my life looks like after learning all this. Elizabeth nodded. If it matters at all, I am sorry. I never wanted anyone else to be hurt by our choices. When Thomas told me he'd married you, I was happy for him. I thought maybe he'd finally found a way to have some happiness despite everything. I never imagined you'd find out. Did you really think it could stay secret forever? That I just accept my husband disappearing for 2 hours every Sunday and never question it? People believe what they want to believe, Elizabeth said softly. Thomas is good at providing plausible explanations. And most people, when they love someone, choose to trust rather than question. It's human nature. She was right, and that made it worse. I had chosen to trust, had wanted to believe in my marriage so much that I'd ignored the small inconsistencies for years. The flowers, the extra mileage, the mud and perfume, I'd explained them all away because the alternative was too painful to consider. I need to go, I said, standing up. I can't be here anymore. Elizabeth stood as well. Will you tell Thomas you came here? I don't know. I don't know anything right now. She walked me to the door, and as I stepped onto the porch, she spoke again. Margaret. I turned back. For what it's worth, I think Thomas does love you. Maybe not the way he loved me when we were young, but in his own complicated way. He talks about you when he visits. You've made him happier than he's been in years. The comment was meant to be comforting, I supposed, but it only made everything more complicated. How could Thomas love me while maintaining this elaborate deception? How could his happiness with me be real when it was built on a foundation of lies? I drove home in a fog, barely registering the road, the other cars, the world moving around me. When I pulled into the driveway of the house on Birch Lane, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the home I'd thought was mine, the life I'd thought I was building. Thomas's car wasn't there. He was still at school, still teaching students about symbolism and metaphor, still playing the role of the devoted widower who'd found love again. In a few hours he'd come home and we'd have dinner together, and he'd ask about my day, and I'd have to decide whether to continue the charade or burn everything down with truth. I went inside and stood in the living room, looking at the photographs on the mantel. Our wedding day, me in a cream-colored suit, Thomas in a dark jacket, both of us smiling at the courthouse steps. Various snapshots from our 3 years together, vacations and holidays and ordinary moments that had seemed precious. Were any of them real? Or was I just a placeholder in Thomas's complicated double life, the public wife to balance the hidden one? In the kitchen, I started preparing dinner mechanically. Chicken breast, roasted vegetables, rice. Tasks I performed hundreds of times, so automatic I didn't need to think about them. Which was good because thinking was becoming dangerous. Every thought led down a rabbit hole of questions I couldn't answer and pain I wasn't ready to face. Thomas came home at 5:30, calling out his usual greeting. Hi honey, I'm home. The normalcy of it, the banality, made me want to scream. How was your day? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. Good. We finished Gatsby today. Some of the students finally understood the green light symbolism. He kissed my cheek, and I had to force myself not to flinch away. How about you? Feeling better? Much better, I lied, adding it to the growing collection of lies that now defined our relationship. We ate dinner. We discussed a documentary on television that Thomas wanted to watch. We cleaned up the kitchen together, moving around each other in the practice dance of a couple who'd shared space for years. It was so normal, so ordinary, and every second of it felt like a betrayal. That night, lying in bed next to my husband who wasn't legally my husband, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him yet. Not until I'd figured out exactly what I wanted, what my options were, what kind of future I could salvage from this wreckage. But I also wasn't going to sit passively by anymore. If Thomas could maintain a secret life, so could I. If he could lie for 3 years straight, I could do the same. And while I was lying, I would be planning, researching, preparing for whatever came next. I thought about Elizabeth, trapped in her cottage by fear and circumstance, living a half-life that wasn't really living at all. I thought about Thomas, split between 2 women, 2 lives, 2 versions of himself. And I thought about me, the wife who wasn't really a wife, the woman who'd built her happiness on foundations that didn't exist. The rain had started again, tapping against the windows like fingers seeking entry. In the darkness, listening to Thomas's steady breathing beside me, I began to formulate a plan. I needed more information about their arrangement, about the legalities of my situation, about what options I had for my future. And I needed to understand why Thomas had done this. Not the surface reasons, the loneliness and the desire for normalcy, but the deeper motivations that would lead a man to commit bigamy, to build an entire life on lies, to risk everything for a charade that could crumble at any moment. Sunday would come again in a few days. Thomas would make his weekly visit to the cottage on Meadowbrook Lane. And this time I would be ready with questions, with demands, with an understanding of exactly what I was dealing with. But first I needed to talk to someone. I needed perspective from outside this tangled web of deception. Tomorrow I would call Claire and tell her everything. Not just about following Thomas, but about Elizabeth, about the fake death, about the bigamy that made my marriage a legal fiction. And then, armed with information and support, I would decide what kind of ending this story would have. Because one thing was certain as I lay there in the darkness listening to the rain: this couldn't continue. The lies had to end one way or another. The only question was whether my marriage would end with them, or if somehow, impossibly, we could build something real from the rubble of all these falsehoods. Claire arrived at my house 20 minutes after I called her Thursday morning. I'd waited until Thomas left for school, then dialed her number with shaking fingers. When she answered, all I could manage was 3 words before my voice broke. "I need you." She sat across from me at the kitchen table now, her face growing paler with each detail I shared. The yellow cottage. The woman who was supposed to be dead. The admission of fake death and 18 years of deception. The casual revelation that my marriage was legally meaningless. When I finished, Claire sat in stunned silence for a full minute before speaking. "Sweet Jesus, Maggie. This is beyond anything I could have imagined. Bigamy. Fraud. How is Thomas even functioning, carrying around a secret this massive? I don't know. That's what terrifies me most. He seems completely normal, like lying to me every single day doesn't even register as wrong anymore." Claire reached across the table and gripped my hand. "What are you going to do? Have you thought about going to the police?" The question had kept me awake for the past 2 nights. And charged him with what? Bigamy? That would destroy his career, possibly send him to prison. And Elizabeth would be exposed too, her fake death revealed. I'd be dragging everyone through public scandal. "He deserves it," Claire said fiercely. "He married you under false pretenses. He's been defrauding you for 3 years. But what do I gain from that? Revenge? Public vindication? I'd still be left picking up the pieces of my life, only now with the added humiliation of everyone in Riverside knowing I was stupid enough to marry a man who was already married." Claire studied my face. "You still love him?" It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I don't know what I feel. Anger, betrayal, confusion. But underneath all that, yes, there's still something. Maybe it's just the ghost of what I thought we had. Or maybe it's real, whatever that even means anymore." "You need to confront him," Claire said firmly. "Not with anger or accusations, but calmly. Lay out what you know and make him explain himself. Then decide based on the truth, not assumptions or half information." She was right. I'd spent days gathering information, but I'd been avoiding the one conversation that mattered most. I needed to hear Thomas's version, needed to understand his reasoning, needed to look him in the eye while he admitted what he'd done. "Will you stay with me while I wait for him?" I asked. "I don't think I can be alone right now." Claire squeezed my hand. "I'm not going anywhere." We spent the day in strange limbo, making small talk that felt absurd given the circumstances, drinking tea neither of us wanted, watching the clock crawl toward evening. Claire helped me prepare dinner. A lasagna that felt like armor against the coming storm. If I had food to serve, maybe I could maintain some semblance of normalcy while my world shattered. Thomas arrived home at his usual time, surprised but pleased to see Claire. He kissed my cheek, greeted my sister warmly, and commented on how good the house smelled. The ease of his deception was remarkable. No nervousness, no guilt visible in his expression. Just a man coming home to his wife and her sister, looking forward to a pleasant dinner. We ate. We talked about inconsequential things. Claire told a story about a difficult client at her law office, carefully avoiding any mention of my situation. Thomas shared an anecdote about a student's creative interpretation of Romeo and Juliet. I pushed food around my plate and tried to remember how to breathe normally. After dinner, Claire helped me clear the dishes, then announced she was leaving. She hugged me tightly at the door, whispering, "You're stronger than you think. Call me after, no matter how late." Then it was just Thomas and me in the living room, the television playing some program neither of us was watching. I could feel the words building in my throat, sharp and dangerous, demanding release. "Thomas, I need to talk to you about something." He looked over at me, smiling. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "I went to the courthouse on Monday. I pulled out the death certificate I've been carrying in my purse all week, and placed it on the coffee table between us. I looked up Elizabeth Miller's death record. The change in his expression was instantaneous. The color drained from his face, his smile froze and cracked, his whole body went rigid. For several seconds, he just stared at the document as if it might spontaneously combust. "Margaret," he started, but I held up my hand. "I also drove out to Meadowbrook Lane. I met Elizabeth. The living, breathing Elizabeth who supposedly died 4 years before I even met you." Thomas's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. He looked like a man drowning, grasping for words that wouldn't come. Finally he managed, "How long have you known?" "Since Sunday. I followed you to the cottage." He closed his eyes and I watched something crumble inside him. The careful walls he built around his double life, the compartments that kept his two worlds separate, all of it collapsing in real time. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet with tears. "I never wanted you to find out this way," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted you to find out at all." The admission, so casual and devastating, ignited something in me. "You never wanted me to find out? That's your concern here? Not that you committed bigamy? Not that you've been lying to me every single day for 3 years? Not that our entire marriage is a fraud?" "It's not a fraud," Thomas said desperately, leaning forward. "What we have is real, Margaret. My feelings for you are real. The life we've built together is real. How can it be real when it's built on lies?" I stood up, needing distance from him, needing to move before the anger paralyzed me. "You were already married when you proposed to me. You looked me in the eye and promised to love me, honor me, forsake all others, when you knew you had a wife hidden away in a cottage. Every anniversary we've celebrated, every time you've said you love me, every moment we've shared has been contaminated by that lie." Thomas buried his face in his hands. "I know. God, I know. There's no excuse for what I've done. But please let me explain how it happened. Elizabeth told me her version. Now I want to hear yours." He took a shaky breath and began. "When Elizabeth got sick, really sick with the agoraphobia, it destroyed our marriage. Not because I stopped loving her, but because we stopped being partners. I became her caretaker, her only connection to the world. Every conversation was about her fears, her needs, her limitations. I couldn't have friends over. I couldn't attend school functions. I couldn't have any life that didn't revolve around managing her illness. I didn't interrupt, though I wanted to. This felt like justification, like he was preparing me to sympathize with his choice. Faking her death seemed like a solution at the time. I could still take care of her, still honor my marriage vows in private, but have a public life too. Be normal again. It was supposed to be temporary, just until she got better. But she never got better. Years passed, and I was trapped in a situation that made less sense with each passing month. And then you met me," I said flatly. "And then I met you." Thomas looked up at me, and the pain in his eyes seemed genuine. "You were different from anyone I'd known. You understood loss. You were independent, strong, content with your own company. I thought I could have a real marriage with you while still honoring my obligations to Elizabeth. I thought I could make it work. By lying to everyone involved. Yes, by lying. It was wrong, Margaret. I know that. But I was drowning in that life with Elizabeth, and you were oxygen. Being with you made me remember what it felt like to be alive instead of just existing. The words should have touched me, should have softened my anger, but they only made it worse. So I was what? Your escape. Your chance to play at having a normal life while your real wife waited in her cottage? No, Thomas stood up, reaching for me, but I stepped back. You're not just an escape. I love you. Differently than I loved Elizabeth, yes, but no less real. These 3 years with you have been the happiest of my life. How can I believe anything you say? Every word out of your mouth for 3 years has been calculated to maintain your lie. How do I know this isn't just another manipulation? Because I'm not trying to hide anymore, he said desperately. You know everything now. There's nothing left to lie about. I'm standing here completely exposed, telling you that I love you and I don't want to lose you. I walked to the window, staring out at the darkening street. Part of me wanted to believe him. Part of me wanted to find a way to forgive this, to rebuild something from the wreckage. But a larger part of me knew that trust, once shattered this completely, might be impossible to restore. What happens to Elizabeth if I report you? I asked without turning around. Thomas was quiet for a moment. She'd be exposed. Her fake death would be revealed. She'd probably face charges for fraud. And she'd have to figure out how to exist in the world again after 18 years of hiding. And you'd go to prison for bigamy. Probably. Yes. I turned to face him. And our marriage? What happens to that? It would be annulled. Declared invalid from the start, as if it never existed. The thought of our 3 years together being legally erased, reduced to nothing more than a mistake that could be wiped from the record, made my chest ache. Whatever else was true, those years had happened. They'd shaped me, changed me, mattered to me. I need time, I said finally. I can't make any decisions right now. I need space to think, to figure out what I want my life to look like after this. Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes. I understand. What do you want me to do? I want you to sleep in the guest room. I want you to give me at least a week without pressure, without pleas, without trying to convince me of anything. And I want complete honesty from this point forward. No more lies, no matter how small. Anything, Thomas said. Whatever you need. He left the room and I heard him climbing the stairs, heard the guest room door close. I stood alone in our living room, surrounded by the physical evidence of our life together, and tried to figure out what kind of person I wanted to be in the aftermath of this revelation. The days that followed were surreal. Thomas and I moved through the house like polite strangers, careful not to intrude on each other's space. He went to work. I went to the library. We prepared separate meals and ate at different times. The house that had felt like a home now felt like a hotel where two people happened to be staying. I spent hours talking to Claire, working through my options. I could report Thomas and Elizabeth, let the legal system sort out the mess. I could simply leave, file for an annulment based on the fraud, start over somewhere new. I could stay and try to rebuild, though Claire thought that was the least likely option to lead to happiness. But there was another option, one that grew more appealing the more I considered it. I could take control of the narrative, make demands rather than simply reacting to what had been done to me. On Saturday, exactly 1 week after my confrontation with Thomas, I drove back to Meadowbrook Lane. Elizabeth answered the door looking unsurprised to see me. I thought you might come back, she said, stepping aside to let me enter. We need to talk, I said. All three of us together. I called Thomas before I left. He'll be here in 20 minutes. We sat in awkward silence until Thomas's car pulled into the driveway. When he entered and saw both of us, he looked like a man facing his executioners. He sat in the chair farthest from both of us, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I've made a decision, I began, looking between them. But before I tell you what it is, I need to say something to both of you. What you've done is unforgivable. You've lied, cheated, committed fraud and bigamy. You've stolen 3 years of my life and built them on foundations that don't exist. I should hate you both. I should report you both. I should burn your lives down the way you've burned mine. Thomas and Elizabeth both looked at the floor, unable or unwilling to meet my eyes. But I'm not going to do that. Not because you deserve mercy, but because I deserve peace. Revenge won't give me back those 3 years. Public scandal won't undo the damage. So here's what's going to happen. I stood up, needing the physical advantage of height to say what came next. Thomas, you're going to officially divorce Elizabeth. I don't care what legal gymnastics are required given that she's supposed to be dead. You'll figure it out. Once that's done, we can decide if there's anything worth saving in our relationship. But I will not be part of a bigamous marriage for 1 more day. Thomas nodded vigorously. Yes, absolutely. Whatever it takes. I turned to Elizabeth. And you're going to get help. Real help, not just from Thomas but from professionals. You've been hiding in this cottage for 18 years. That's not living. You're going to find a therapist who specializes in agoraphobia, and you're going to do the hard work of learning to exist in the world again. Elizabeth looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. I don't know if I can. You can, because the alternative is staying trapped forever. And I won't let Thomas keep enabling that. If he wants any chance of salvaging things with me, he has to let you go. Really let you go, not just legally but emotionally. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then Elizabeth said quietly, "You're right. You're absolutely right. I've been a coward long enough." Thomas looked between us, something like hope dawning on his face. Does this mean, are we going to try to make this work? I don't know, I answered honestly. Right now I don't trust you. I don't know if I'll ever trust you again. But I'm willing to see if it's possible, if you do exactly what I've asked. Complete transparency. Legal divorce from Elizabeth. Therapy for both of you. And time, lots of time, for me to figure out if there's anything real underneath all the lies. I'll do whatever it takes, Thomas said. I swear to you, Margaret, I will earn back your trust. 2 years have passed since that day in the cottage. Thomas did divorce Elizabeth. A complicated process that required admitting to the fake death and paying substantial fines but ultimately avoiding prison. Elizabeth started therapy and has made remarkable progress. She leaves the cottage now, small trips at first, then longer ones. Last month she attended a book club at the library, her first social event in nearly 2 decades. Thomas and I are still together, though it's a different kind of together than before. We went to couples therapy for 18 months, working through the betrayal, learning to communicate honestly, building new foundations. I kept my own apartment for the first year, a safety net in case I needed to leave. I only moved back into the house on Birch Lane 6 months ago, and even now, part of me remains ready to flee if the trust breaks again. Do I love him? I'm still figuring that out. There are days when I look at him and feel nothing but tenderness, gratitude for the way he's worked to make amends, hope for the future we might build. And there are days when I see him and remember the lies, feel the betrayal fresh and sharp, wonder what I'm doing trying to salvage something so broken. But I'm 76 now, and I've learned that life is rarely simple, that people are capable of both terrible betrayal and genuine redemption, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay and fight for something instead of running away. The yellow cottage still stands on Meadowbrook Lane, but Elizabeth plans to sell it soon. She's moving to a small apartment in town, close to her therapist and the support group she's joined. Thomas doesn't visit her anymore. That chapter of both their lives is finally officially closed. As for me, I'm rebuilding my life on my own terms this time. I retired from the library last year and started writing, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. I'm working on a memoir about second chances, about betrayal and forgiveness, about the complicated ways we love each other and hurt each other, and somehow find ways to move forward. I'm not the woman I was 3 years ago when I first discovered Thomas's secret. That woman was devastated, broken, lost. I'm someone different now, harder in some ways, softer in others, more aware of my own strength and more cautious with my trust. People ask me sometimes if I regret staying, if I wish I'd left Thomas when I first discovered the truth. The answer is complicated. I regret the years of lies, the betrayal, the pain. But I don't regret fighting for what I wanted, making demands instead of accepting what was given to me, taking control of my own story instead of being just a victim in someone else's. Maybe that's the real lesson here. When your world falls apart, you get to decide how to rebuild it. You get to set the terms, establish the boundaries, demand what you need to heal. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you can build something stronger than what was broken. The grave at Riverside Memorial still has Elizabeth Miller's name on it. We decided to leave it there, a monument to a chapter that's finally ended. A reminder that sometimes the dead can come back to life, and the living can find new ways to exist. And every Sunday now, instead of visiting that grave, Thomas and I take a walk together through Riverside Park. It's our new ritual, our way of reclaiming that day, of building something honest where lies used to live. Sometimes we talk about the past, sometimes about the future, sometimes we just walk in comfortable silence. It's not the life I thought I'd have when I married Thomas 7 years ago. But it's real, built on truth instead of deception, and after everything we've been through, that feels like enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.